Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with a quick discussion on music samples. This is sampled library mockups. We're talking about samples and what they do, what they can do, what they need to do, what some might not do, and why most of that discussion doesn't really matter because I think in the realm of mockup, creating mockups, whether you're working in a digital audio workstation or now from notation with some of these playback engines that we have and the sample libraries that we have for those engines. I think that it has been somewhat forgotten, at least on the notation side, that the artist in the mockup is you. It's the user. It's not the libraries. And the more information that the user puts into the mockup, the better the mockup. That has always been the case. It will always have to be the case. We'll discuss some of why that is, why I think that is anyway. But I want to show you something first. This is me. If you've never seen me before, that's me. And that's a deck of cards right there, and I'm going to shuffle them. I'm going to shuffle the cards. So before you play a game, it's really important that you always give the cards a good mix. So we'll just give it a quick table wash, kind of mush them together, and break up the packets a little bit. They say that if you really want to shuffle cards, you should shuffle them. If you're going to do like a riffle shuffle in the hands, you should do 7 separate shuffles to get it right. But here we're going to try to get through this quickly. Just mush them together. You can see they're out of order there. And give them a quick riffle shuffle and give them a cut. Always, cut the cards. Trust the shuffle, but cut the cards, as they say. But if you look at the situation here, you'll see something interesting. They're entirely in order. Ace through king spades, ace through king diamonds, ace through king clubs, ace through king hearts. So I am actually a card magician as well. I'm a close-up magician. It's a hobby that I've had since I was very young. I publish in this area. I've written a few books on card magic and created a few effects that are used in professional shows. That is a vocabulary that I have. Now, for someone who does not know and is casually looking at this situation, it looks odd, right? Everything's being shuffled, but they're not shuffled. And I can tell you that at no point, and if you go back and if you analyze the video, you'll see what's going on. But if you look at it as a casual viewer, as a spectator, it's an effect. For the magician, it's vocabulary. It's a trick. It's an illusion of something happening that is not actually happening. And the fact is that at no point in that little demonstration, at no point are the cards ever actually mixed. They're never actually mixed. There's subtleties in there to demonstrate the illusion that they are mixed, even to the point of looking at the faces of the cards to see that they must be mixed, but they're not. It's all an illusion. It's all part of the demonstration to point to something that it is not. Using sample libraries and creating mock-ups is this. It is an illusion. It's an illusion of something that is real. And in reality, I would argue that even the process of recording a live group and using technology such as mixing technology and mastering and effects technology that you would typically use to get a balance of a recording. I'll even take this a step further. When I go hear the symphony orchestra at an outdoor venue, summer's coming, there'll be some outdoor concerts coming up, and the nearest symphony orchestra to me is the Rochester Symphony Orchestra in Rochester, New York, just up the road. When I go hear them play and do their 4th of July, their July kind of, park venue concerts, there will be a mic array and there will be a mixing engineer. And what I will hear will be what's coming out of the speakers in addition to what's coming off of the stage in that outdoor environment. Even in that situation, what I'm hearing is actually an illusion because it's being modified in some way to give what an audience, a contemporary audience, perceives to be, should be, the cleanest, best outcome. And if, as a mixing engineer, someone who understands that, if I'm watching it and I think of that vocabulary, I will sense all of those tricks that are in play. Now you take that a step further, and then you have recording artistry, where you take an orchestra, you record them, and then you edit that recording in various ways, and you mix it properly, and you get a film score performance of a live orchestra, or an archived recording of a performance. And then if you take that a step further, you can go with the very best libraries that are out there, mixed with some live instrumentation, and so on, until you get all the way down to, MIDI. just MIDI performances on, a sound font, or even less, a lower quality, Korg or synthesizers or whatever. Those old keyboard patches that were, very dated from the 90s, 80s and 90s. In fact, there's an article I do want to reference here, and I bring this up sometimes. I wish I could find it, but it was from an old periodical back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the turn of the millennium there, with James Newton Howard, and he had scored Disney's Dinosaur. I think it was Disney. I think Disney did that, Dinosaur. Maybe it wasn't Disney, but there is a little cue that he mocks up in that article, where he says, when I'm showing what I'm working on to clients, I want to have a good mock-up to show them what they can expect. And he does a cue called, I think the cue was called, at least on the soundtrack album, was The Egg Travels. And in the online article, they play back, or they give you an MP3 of that cue, that his mock-up, and then they give you the MP3 of the actual recording. And back in the day, you heard that and you said, oh my goodness, the mock-up sounds real. They're not identical, but it sounds real. It would pass, and you wonder why even bother recording the orchestra, was a question that was brought up back in the day. And there's reasons for that we're not going to get into. But I just want to point out that James Newton Howard, back in the day, he was using his own samples, which was limited technology at the time. But a lot of what he was using was just the old Korg, sound samples that were on the various synthesizers that you had. And he'd play each thing in by hand into an audio sequencer, and you create the mock-up. And a lot of composers would mock up in that way back in that era. And nonetheless, it is the performance using the samples that makes it real. It's the performance in the mixing. It's that element that really drives home the realism of the mock-up. And that has not changed. That has not changed. There is an infatuation with getting new, greater, better libraries that sample more extensive performances of instrumentation, to the point where we're actually sampling fragments of actual music being played and putting them into the libraries to get the best outcome. And this infatuation with this results in magicians, right? Us as the magicians calling out the vocabularies we see it as being fake. And that's just ridiculous, because to the listener, to the real listener, to the spectator, they don't know the difference between a real recording and a mock-up that has a lot of data input on it on simple samples. They don't know the difference, right? And, I'm not saying that it's not worth buying expensive libraries or buying the latest, greatest libraries. What I'm saying is it's not worth criticizing libraries when you misunderstand how you're supposed to use them. What we ought to be criticizing is the mock-ups themselves, whether or not the mock-up artist, the composer, the person behind the console, has put in the effort to give a realistic performance of the tools that they have. Now, I want to relate this here to MuseScore, because one of the criticisms that we're talking about here is having multiple round-robin samples or multiple layers, particularly on longer legato passages. Now, I argue I don't see the point in that. If you are playing a fragment of music, and then that same fragment of music, a long fragment of music, is being played back immediately in context to the first one, and because it is immediately played and it's identical, that it is noticed. First of all, I question that it's actually noticed by real listeners. But secondly, I argue, why are you doing it exactly the same? not only in terms of notation, but just in terms of the playback. Like that's a big no-no. You, as the performer, can use samples that are available to you that may be limited and change the performance as a performer would do on the second iteration. That would make it completely passable as a realistic performance. This is how musicians work. Anybody who spent time as a musician learning an instrument or voice or whatever with a good teacher, in an institution with high caliber learning, collegiate or conservatory learning, that good teacher will say, look, if you got the same thing twice, you're going to do it different the second time. Well, you need to make sure in terms of musical choices that you do that. That is just what a musician does. So let's look at an example here. I've got a MuseScore opened here. I've got violins 1. So this is just the violins 1 patch, mezzo forte. It's this excerpt played again with a slur on these eighth notes. Now, first of all, let's recognize that it plays legato. That's just what the engine does, and I'll get to that in a moment. But let's listen to this example, and then we'll do some comparison. Okay, so it's the same thing twice. And what does it sound like? Well, it sounds like the same thing twice. It's calling upon generally the same samples. Now, that may not be entirely true because the engine is doing some secret stuff there. It's, the engine itself, the playback engine is making some choices. And this is what I want to point out. An argument about what I'm going to look at here in a moment in notation. There's an argument about the value of doing this versus just doing it in a MIDI mockup because you're going to be adding all this controller data anyway. Now, I argue that the engine itself is actually doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's adding portamento in there by its own choosing based on what the notation looks like, and it's making a few musical choices. I argue it's making just enough musical choices that if it was making more musical choices than what it is, I actually would be upset as a user because it means that it doesn't leave room for me to interfere, right, and to give a directorial performance in this. I want it to be making some automated choices, but I don't want it to be making all of the choices. If it's making all of the choices, then it's actually in the way. And some of you argue that this legato stuff that it does, some of this portamento that's just overdone in the regular sample, and of course you can change that obviously with some of the sound flags or whatever. That the way that it's doing this is already making too many choices, and that's fine. You can interrupt that, but you can see my point here. If it was doing more than what it's doing, we would probably be butting heads more with the engine than we are right now. I say it's making just the right number of choices, and the rest is really up to me in terms of creating a mock-up. You'll never get, and some people argue with AI and with algorithm, and library, example analysis that an AI engine should be able to give you a spot-on performance directly from the notation. I argue that that's never possible. For the simple fact that if you take a piece of music, you put it in front of an orchestra, and you give it a director, you'll get a performance. And if you change the director, you'll get a different performance. If you change the orchestra, you'll get a different performance. If you do an orchestra in Los Angeles and then you do an orchestra in London with different directors, you'll get a very different performance. And it's all the same music. Even more, if you put the composer in the room, you'll get a very different performance because the composer is going to ask for things. And that's what your job is. You're the composer. This is your orchestra. You are supposed to interfere and give direction. This is how good mock-ups are made in the notation mock-up realm that we have now with these really great playback engines. Not just here, but Note Performer. I mean, there's other engines out there, and they all require the same kind of intervention. So let's look at a way that we could fix this. Well, first of all, the big argument is, what I need more samples. I need another layer of samples so that the second time that I hear it, it's not the same. And it needs to be able to choose this intelligently. Well, I'm going to force the hand here because we actually do, in the Muse Sounds, we have a separate sample for violins 1 and violins 2. So here's an example of the same line where it switches to violins 2 on the second iteration. Same music, different sample set performing it. Is it different? Yes, it is different. Is it a lot different? No. Is it as different for the viewer, for the listener, the lay spectator, going back to this magician analogy, the person that's just hearing the music, probably in some context with other things going on? Is it different enough that it matters? No. No. And if you say that it is, I think you're denying your magician vocabulary. You're thinking too much like someone with inside knowledge. It is different. In general, it's quieter. I mean, that's kind of the big thing. They are different samples, but I do argue that it is the same performance. It's just the same performance with different samples. And that's all that it is. It still lacks a great deal of musicianship, even with all the heavy lifting that the engine is doing in terms of the portamento choices and even some of the in and out crossfading of the notation that it's doing, the changes between the notes, the way that it glues them together, all that heavy lifting, even with that, it's still not very musical. And just merely having a separate set of samples is not going to solve a lot of your problems. You still end up with a lot of the same. I argue that the term machine gunning is used a lot. Now, the whole point behind machine gunning in MIDI mockup is that when you have a rapid succession as a machine gun, it sounds like a machine gun. It's the same thing happening over and over again. And you want to have not merely different samples. It's not enough to just have different samples, round-robin samples, to avoid machine gunning. You actually need to change the velocity of those subsequent notes in order to eliminate the machine gunning. I don't see how this term applies to legato and longer passages, because obviously the analogy breaks down. You're not actually machine gunning in that point. It's just mere repetition, and it's identical repetition, even though it's separated in time. I have my doubts that this is noticed by casual listeners, a real listener, right? But nonetheless, as I said, a good musician would play something different the second time. Okay, well, that comes down to musical choices that are really separate from the samples. So let's look at this again. This time, we're going to use the same sample for two performances. And you can see I put in some dynamic changes. I even changed a few note lengths in here. And another thing that I did is I layered with another sample set that I have, which is a solo string. And if you look at the mixer, what I have is I have this panned actually to the left as if it's in a section. And I have the violins solo at a different reverb setting, lower reverb setting, and panned less to the left than the section. It's as if it's a little closer, like you hear that one player in the front. Now what I'm doing is I'm making engineering choices that are specific to the mock-up that I want to have. What are the limits of these choices? The sky is the limit of these choices. The variables, go back to the card analogy. Real quick, if you shuffle a deck of cards, and there's 52 cards, 52 positions, if I randomly shuffle, what is the chance that a person or two people would ever randomly shuffle a deck of cards into the exact same state? Do you know what the number is? 52 positions, 52 cards, not very many variables. Do you know what the number is? It is a number with 68 zeros in it. And what it ends up, and it seems unthinkable, it ends up that it really is an impossibility. The chance that two people would ever shuffle a deck of cards ever in the history of the world this same way is really zero. It will never happen. That number is too big and the probability is too vast. And if you're skeptical at this claim, just understand that a new deck order where every card is in its original position, ace through king, and there's different positions for different manufacturers. But if you consider that that is a order of cards, what we're looking at is the chance that anybody would ever accidentally, randomly shuffle a deck of cards into new deck order. That is the probability that any two people would ever do it the same way. The variables are 52 and 52, right? But here, our variables are considerably more vast than that. We're talking about individual note lengths. We're talking about individual note dynamics. We're talking about changes in dynamics. We're talking about interpretations in terms of articulation and samples that we have for those. You know, the sky's the limit with MuseScore just the way it is without anything extra. And honestly, the sky was the limit when you had the Muse Sounds. If you really dug in deep, the classic MS Sounds, if you really dug in deep, some people were making some really good playback files. I know I was back in the day when I was using Finale and just the sound font that came with, even before the Garritan Personal Orchestra stuff came in, which honestly didn't sound all that great anyway. You know, the sky is the limit, especially with this sample set that we have in Muse Sounds, and that is apart from all the ones that you can buy. Just with the Muse Sounds alone, plus the classic sound font that we have in there, plus all the articulations that we have, plus the dynamics, plus the note lengths and the phrasing choices that you can make. All of this stuff, the sky is the limit in terms of the performance. Now, this is still, I argue, a performance of this. It is essentially this line played twice, mezzo forte, by a section. But this is what we get. It's not the same thing twice. It's not the same thing twice. Are some of the samples called up the same twice? Yes. But we are in so deep right now that the viewer, the non-magician here, I should start saying the non-musician here, or even more than that, any musician, but the person that didn't create the file, the one that knows the inside secrets, they simply are not going to appreciate the fact that specific samples are being caught up. It's ridiculous to suggest otherwise. It just isn't true. It's beyond the pale to really consider these things. Now, this, you can go further than this. As you see, all I did is I changed one and then I copied it and pasted it in the other. It's just the same choices for both instruments. Or both sample sets. Now this gets down to how much work is it to do this? Well, it's still less work than doing MIDI entry because, as I said, the the engine itself is doing most of the heavy lifting. It's doing a lot of choices that you would otherwise have to do with like a portamento, a legato set of samples, where you would have to choose to overlay the MIDI notation to call up on those samples so that the engine will do it. You'd have to input that data. Well, MuseScore is doing it by itself. It's already doing that. The Play Engine's doing that. Likewise, in terms of some of the choices that it's making in terms of these articulations, all I had to do was put the articulation in, and it's making those choices in terms of the performance on its own. It's reading from notation what I'm doing. So all I'm doing here is I'm adding some dynamic alteration, and if I choose to take this further, I could add some articulation, and I'm changing some note lengths, not many, just a couple places where I'm going to allow the music to breathe a little bit. Now, this is a string section. It's not a wind section. They're not really breathing. But string players breathe. I mean, they breathe too in terms of phrasing. I put a little bit of a break in here, which will break up some of the legato that we don't want the engine to call up. You could also do this by adding an articulation on here if you want to. And I'm changing it so that in between the first version and the second version, the choices are slightly different. Okay, and I can be economical by doing it in one and then copying it and pasting it into the other sample. If I'm doing this in MIDI orchestration, I would do the same kind of thing, but my controller data would be more vast, right? There'd be more expression data that I'm entering than what I have here, more velocity data that I'm entering than what I have here, and also I would probably be layering more samples than what I have here. In terms of articulation, to get all of the articulations that I need. I would go to one sample set and then another sample set and then another sample set, either by key switching or by layering them, whatever your choice is, or I would be using, again, some kind of performance-based sample set, which is what this is, and I would be telling it to call up various kinds of articulations by the way that I'm playing it into the keyboard. Okay, so there's that. Now, I want to go to yet another model. What I did here is I just swapped. I copied and pasted, but then I swapped the two performances so that part one, the violin one, solo violin, is playing the second performance first and then the first performance second. And then in addition to this, what I did is I went into these succession of eighth notes, and I made on the solo one, a couple of them are dotted, just one here and one here, to give a little bit of outside forced human error to the performance, to add a little bit of realism. And this is what we get. And you hear what happens is that you get a little bit of that portamento jump here, but only on a solo instrument. You see that? This note connects to that note. So MuseScore, using these default sounds, it grabs that portamento, but only for one player. The section doesn't do that. This is very real. This is a very real kind of artifact that you would get from a section. This is how you mock up. This is how you do it. It's not about having more libraries. You can have more libraries. There's benefits to more libraries. Libraries do what they do. But my point is that you can force the libraries, the limited libraries that you have, to do some really amazing things. Just ask James Newton Howard and his Korg synthesizer from 2000. Okay, that's my point. Anyway, I argue that a lot of this talk about samples and the need for them and what can be done, what could never be done, is all really, it's magician talk. It's magicians talking about their secrets and how they can recognize their own vocabulary. If a magician watches me, if I'm on Penn and Teller's Fool Us and I do that little thing, Penn and Teller know exactly what's going on, right? The person with that vocabulary recognizes the unshuffling of the cards. But that's not what we're doing. We're generating an illusion for other people, not for people with inside information. Anyway, a different perspective, that's my argument. I do stand by mocking up in notation. I don't think you really, I think we're getting to a point very quickly, if we're not already there, where you can do remarkably acceptable mock-ups in notation without going into Digital Audio Workstation. And that's because of the same things that are powering the Digital Audio Workstation, that is the AI engines that are making some of the grunt work choices for us. And then we just have to go in and put the cherries on top and do a little bit of seasoning here and there. One last comment on this. You only have to do this kind of specificity whenever you have very exposed moments. The less exposed the orchestration is, the less of this you really need to do, the more layering you have. And that has always been the case, even in Digital Audio Workstation work. If you're working in MIDI, you really don't need to do as much controller data whenever the orchestration is thicker. It's when things start to get exposed that you have to get very particular about the choices that you're making, and so goes here. So in terms of, having to do all of this stuff, and do what some of you might think of as tricks and hacks, you don't really have to do as much as you really think in most of your scores. You just need to do a little bit of it here and there. And I argue again, they're not tricks and hacks. It is actually art. It's the science of mocking up. It's the vocabulary of mocking up. And it's never going to change. It's always going to be there. You're always going to be doing things like this to get realism out of your music performance. So anyway, best of luck with that. Happy composing, happy mixing.